There are a lot of questions that we could ask the religious, but honestly, what's the point? They have no credible answers, and they don't actually care if they're wrong. They just want the internal tingle that they get when they believe emotionally comforting crap, and we're just going to see some more of that today. Strap in because this is not going to be pretty. Honestly, we hardly ever look at somebody like Ken Ham around here, and that's kind of on purpose. There are some apologists that are just so laughably ridiculous, and I might do some of those because my audience needs a chuckle, but generally speaking, I don't bother because what's the point? There are some that pose some potentially interesting but ultimately useless questions, and I do some of those to show that it's all just dumb. But then there are people like Ken Ham, who is usually just an idiot 100% of the time. But not an over-the-top idiot because, I don't think he thinks that hard about pretty much anything. However, relatively recently, he's done a couple of videos that I thought looked kind of interesting, so here we are. I'm going to spread them out a little bit, but here's why we laugh at the likes of Ken Ham. Sit back, strap in, and try to enjoy.
One of the most asked questions I've been asked over the years is, where did Cain get his wife?
Honestly, if I just had Ken Ham sitting right here in front of me, that is not a question that would ever come to mind. Not ever. That's so far down the list of things that I'd even care about, since his position is so far out of whack with reality that I probably wouldn't bother. Granted, I doubt that he really gets this question. It's just a subject for a video and something he just made up in his head. And of course, as we all know, he's not above just lying about it. And if you look at the video description, it's just a vehicle for selling his book, so I guess we can't really be that surprised. And if you notice, he's just turned off ratings like the chicken shit that he is, but the comments are open, and it's really sad to watch the ludicrous fawning going on, because the people who follow around a Ken Ham type, they're real idiots. But then again, of course, we can't really be that surprised, can we? So go ahead, Ken. Tell us your answer. I bet it's just soaked in blind faith and my book says a thing, which is not remotely impressive. So continue, good sir. We need a laugh.
Some people seem to have the idea that Adam and Eve only had 3 children, Cain and Abel and Seth. But Genesis 5:4 says Adam had other sons and daughters.
Obviously. In fact, I have never run into anyone who didn't understand that. The problem with the Cain narrative is this. People, read Christians, don't want to believe that the entire human species came about as a product of incest. There's a kind of an ick factor there, unless, of course, you're from Appalachia. Therefore, the only options are that Cain got it on with his mother, or that he got it on with one of his sisters, neither of which are acceptable to a lot of people, especially modern people. And I've heard some Christians just make stuff up like, well, God just made other humans afterwards, and that's where he got his wife. But that is not at all biblical. That's just a bald rationalization. So I guess Ken is just going with incest. I can't wait to see how he argues his way around the problems most people are going to have with it, but I guess he's going to have to. So let's see.
In fact, there's a Jewish tradition, and this is written up in Josephus, a famous Jewish historian, that they had 33 sons and 23 daughters. Well, that's only tradition. We don't know for sure, but certainly they had other sons and daughters, which means originally, if there are only 2 people, Adam and Eve to start with, then brothers had to marry sisters.
Which a lot of people are going to have a problem with. Granted, someone like Ken doesn't care, and if that's what actually happened in reality, fine, it doesn't matter. Reality just is what it is. But the whole Adam and Eve story is just ridiculous mythology, so that means virtually nothing. This is another reason why I don't think Ken is worth much, because he doesn't care about reality at all. In fact, he's very clear about that. So long as his book says a thing, he's going to go with it without a single thought crossing his minuscule little pea brain. This is very common among religious apologists. They don't have to justify any of this stuff. They just say, it's in my book. And somehow that just makes it true. Except it doesn't. So he's still got another 3.5 minutes of video. I don't know what else he can say, but maybe this is going to go somewhere interesting. Or maybe this is just going to be where the bald rationalizations come in and, well, my book is automatically right. Yeah, I wouldn't be at all surprised.
I remember once on a radio program, an atheist called up and said, I'm an atheist, and if you believe brothers married sisters, that's immoral. Well, first thing I said was, you're an atheist. You can't accuse anyone else of being immoral. And what do you base your standards?
Sure you can. First off, I have no clue if any of this ever happened at all. People like Ken just tend to make up useful stories at a whim because they really want it to be true. It gets them where they want to go. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here, since I can kind of see that happening. But it's not because I trust Ken farther than I can throw him. It's because, well, the video would get kind of boring if we didn't. Secondly, though, I would disagree because, as he said, morality is subjective. Ken wouldn't agree, of course, which is kind of the problem here, because if he believes that morality is objective, then that would actually make some of this stuff a problem, wouldn't it? The fact that it was an atheist asking shouldn't change anything, right? Ken thinks the atheist is wrong. So I'm not sure how that works out in his favor unless morality isn't actually objective, something that Ken clearly doesn't believe. Maybe he'll explain, I don't know. Let's watch.
Now, the point is, the doctrine of marriage is one man for one woman for life. That's what marriage is all about. So we have a man and a woman, a brother and sister, getting married.
You're still going to have to deal with that ick factor, though, aren't you? Sure, brothers and sisters do get married. Cousins get married. It's kind of a thing. Albert Einstein, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, H.G. Wells, Johann Sebastian Bach. Heck, Kevin Bacon is married to a distant cousin. Like I said, it's a thing. If you go through history, there's a bunch of Egyptian rulers who married their sisters. In fact, Egyptian mythology is full of it. Osiris married his sister Isis. Nut and her brother Geb were together, among others. Royalty used to keep it in the family a lot. There's a story that Herod Agrippa II was involved with his sister Berenice, although that's widely disputed. This really isn't that uncommon throughout history, and like I said before, Appalachia is a place, even though a lot of that is just a joke. Don't worry, people in Appalachia, I'm not really making fun of you, it's just kind of a thing. From a realistic standpoint, we know that it happens, but it's still been widely culturally demonized, and because Ken is appealing to his followers on an emotional level, he's still going to need to deal with that. So let's see if he can.
Now, keep in mind that 1 Corinthians 15:45 says Adam was the first man. Genesis 3:20, Eve was the mother of all the living, so there was only one man and one woman to start with, which means brothers had to marry sisters.
Now, he might get to this in a second, I don't know, but I wanted to cut him off anyhow. There is an argument, since Adam and Eve were specially made by God, that they had no genetic problems, and thus interbreeding offspring wouldn't risk anything coming out with two heads and webbed toes. And you have to remember that Adam and Eve were basically the same individual, with Eve being made out of the rib of Adam, thus they would have pretty much the same genetic code. In fact, they'd have to have the exact same genetic code, and I'm not sure how the hell that works given two different sexes. But it's all made up mumbo jumbo anyhow, so it doesn't really matter, does it? So anyway, let's see if I'm reading where he's going, because I may be or may not be. I don't know. They're not usually that difficult to understand, but, I could be wrong. So let's see what he's going to say.
But it wasn't against God's law until the time of Moses in Leviticus. Remember, Abraham was married to his half-sister, and that wasn't a problem.
That assumes that any of it ever happened at all. Remember, he has to appeal to modern-day believers, and if they look at their Bibles and say, ew, that's enough to drive some people away. I don't think it should be, since faith ought to overcome personal revulsion, but if these things are true, which of course they're not, but if they were true, that's all that ought to matter. That's all that matters to somebody like Ken. There's a lot of real stuff out there that's kind of disgusting in the modern mind, but it is still true. So what? So this is really entirely irrelevant. It's a silly question that means nothing whatsoever, and I'd say that so far he's at least explained it pretty well. But really, what's he going to do for the next 2.5 minutes? Let's see.
But at the time of Moses, God brought in this law that no longer could close relations marry. Now, why was that? Well, there could be a number of reasons for that, including no longer do close relations need to marry because there's so many people now.
But we're not talking about distant cousins. We're talking about brothers and sisters, direct siblings. A couple of generations in, and that wouldn't have been necessary because there would have been lots of people around. No matter how you look at it, it wouldn't have really mattered, especially if people were giving birth to huge litters like Jewish tradition says of Adam and Eve. You would have had siblings to start, but then cousins and the distance would just get farther and farther away, and it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't have gotten to the time of Moses before you couldn't avoid boinking your sister. Now, I think he had another point on the subject, so let's go get back to Ken, already in progress.
But sin has affected everything. And when Adam sinned, then God withdrew some of that sustaining power, so now there would be mutations and mistakes, generation after generation, that would add up.
First off, sin isn't real. It's just something that the religious made up, and granted, this is just Ken blathering on about nonsense, but sin is just something in your head, which is all it can possibly be. It doesn't affect your genes. In fact, I can't even imagine a way that it could. Of course, for the religious, the idea of sin is just a bald rationalization, and because that's all it is, then it can supposedly do anything, I guess. Well, I don't get it, therefore sin did it. That's kind of a thing. Nothing realistic, nothing defensible, nothing you can actually demonstrate with evidence, but the religious are kind of allergic to all that, aren't they? Big surprise there.
Now, here's the problem. If close relatives married today, it's more likely they've got the same mistakes, and those mistakes can get together and cause problems in the offspring. But the further away in relationship from each other you are, the more likely it is you could have different mistakes. So where there's a bad gene here, a good one here, so the good one can mask the bad one.
So basically what I predicted a while back. He eventually gets there after a fair bit of rambling, because this is Ken Ham we're talking about. Of course, he can't demonstrate that any of this is true, beyond the modern biology, since it's all just an article of faith, and faith doesn't mean anything. And I know that he doesn't accept that, but it's still true. This is what happens when we look at the dumb people and their unjustified beliefs. It's really just like watching a bunch of kids on a playground telling each other stories. Well, my dad can beat up your dad. Yeah, I can imagine back in the old days, my God can beat up your God. In fact, that actually happens in the Bible, more or less. That was the whole point of Moses and the fight against the Egyptian priests, right? So, because Ken doesn't care about actual reality, he's just going with the fantasy stories in his big book of multiple choice. It's no wonder this stuff makes us roll our eyes. Because it should.
And praise the Lord for all those good genes that do mask our bad genes, or we'd be in a mess.
We'd be extinct, but your imaginary friend has nothing at all to do with it. This is really why people like Ken are such a ludicrous joke, because they keep falling back on God did it without any evidence for any of it. That having an intelligent conversation with them is just impossible because they are not intelligent on their own. They believe what they want to believe, and they're incapable of changing their minds because they're not using them in the first place. I get what he wants to be true, but who cares what he wants? It doesn't matter. Only reality does, and he's lost any grasp on reality that he might have ever had when he embraced his own religious stupidity in his head.
And so it makes sense that by the time of Moses, God said, no longer can close relatives marry. Now, some people claim, oh, wait a minute, brother and sister marrying, that's incest. Well, first of all, there's a lot of things under the word incest that are immoral, but not brother and sister marriage in the context of biblical history.
Granted, he's just making up his morality as he goes along. That's not how any of this actually works, and I don't want to have to criticize the religious take on objective morality once again. We've done that plenty of times in the past. That they really want these things to be true, that doesn't make any of it true, and that's why I reject their faith and their fifis across the board, because absolutely none of it is at all defensible. None of it can be supported with any defensible, demonstrable, verifiable evidence. None of it is remotely demonstrably true. Not that they care or anything, because they are only concerned with their own feelings, and because their feelings can't be wrong, because they'd be feeling really bad if they were, then everything that they say is perfect and true, so there, just ask them. These people are real idiots, and Ken Ham is often at the head of the idiot parade. Why is that not a surprise?
Now, the word incest didn't come about until about the 12th century or so. So there was no word incest before then. It's interesting how we'll have secularists claim, oh, that's incest, again making a moral judgment when they have no basis for such morality to be able to do that.
Here we go again. Yes, the English word incest didn't come around until about 1200 CE, but that doesn't mean that the concept didn't exist before that. If you go back to ancient China, first cousins with the same surnames, meaning they were born to their father's brothers, they were not allowed to marry. Clearly, they understood the concept of incest, even if they didn't use that specific word to describe it. Back at the time of the First Persian Empire, around 550 BCE, something like that, they allowed marriages between half-siblings, nieces, cousins, things like that, but not between direct brothers and sisters. According to Herodotus, one of the Persian kings supposedly married two of his sisters, and his detractors used these blasphemous actions to illustrate why he was mad and vain. Clearly, they understood what incest was, even if they didn't use that word to describe it. So the idea that nobody had a clue about incest or had words to describe it before the 1200s is just ludicrous. But this is Ken Ham we're talking about here, and ludicrous is his middle name.
But from an evolutionist perspective, from a secular perspective, what do they believe? That man evolved from ape-like creatures, marriage is whatever you want to make it to be, whatever man arbitrarily defines it could be, so anything could do anything with whatever, and they think we've got the problem?
No, we're the ones that are actually living in the real world. I mean, a lot of that was just nonsense, and I will admit that there's a lot of modern takes on marriage, etc., that are just laughable in my opinion, but far too many people are just running on pure fifis and faith, just declaring that what they want to be true is true, and what they don't want to be true is false, and then screaming incoherently at anyone who disagrees because they're suddenly sad. It's stupid no matter who does it. Like I said, I'm consistent in all of this, and tons of people out there don't seem to be. Leave your feelings behind and deal with the real world as it actually is. Honestly, it's not that hard.
They're the ones that have the problem. So there's no problem with brother and sister marriage originally, provided it's one man for one woman.
You're just assuming that your fantasy stories are real because you really, really like them, but that doesn't make them real. Are there reasons not to have close relations intermarrying or really interbreeding? Absolutely. It's not healthy in a genetic sense. Now, if a brother and a sister want to get fixed and then, well, whatever they wanted to do, would I really care? Probably not. Is it immoral? Morals are just rules that societies come up with to ensure the stability and longevity of the society, and if they don't care, I really probably don't either. I wouldn't go breaking their door down and dragging them off into the street because, oh my God, you're breaking God's law. Granted, I wouldn't do that for anyone who wasn't violating the law of the land, even metaphorically, so, yeah, I don't really know what to tell you. I'm not pretending that it violates some laughable holy writ like Ken is, because Ken is an idiot.
Remember, when you get married today, you do marry your relative. Everyone who gets married marries their relative because we are all related. It's just we don't marry our close relative. And actually, the principle for that really does come from Scripture.
No, it doesn't. I have no idea what he's going to say next. I just wanted to acknowledge that in this instance, yes, he is right, because we are all related in some way, because everything on the planet is related if you go back far enough. Ken wouldn't like that, of course, but it's still factually true. Evolution is a vast, interconnected web of life. It only really matters when the genes are close enough and the mutations are potentially bad enough that interbreeding is likely to produce some pretty bad outcomes, or it could. Otherwise, we're all just animals doing what animals do. Welcome to the real world.
It's interesting, if you Google it, you'll find that different countries have different rules in regard to how close a relationship you can be for marriage.
And there goes the proof that objective morality means absolutely nothing again, right? Sorry, just throwing it in there because that right there proves that morality is entirely subjective. If everyone has different ideas of what is moral, and the question of incest is mostly a moral question, then there goes objectivity or universality, right? Sorry, let's get back to Ken while he wraps this up.
Simply because there's no, set rule in regard to that. But we understand the principle, and that principle comes from Scripture. Close relations should no longer marry.
Because your book says a thing. That's what this all comes down to. He really likes his book. His book says a thing, therefore it's just got to be true, so there. And this is really, really stupid, yet how often do we see this from the religious? While I was writing this, someone posted in the channel on a video I did about the moral argument a while back, and they just repeated the moral argument verbatim, declared it true, and just said, well, I'm wrong. Apparently, they never watched the video, not like that's a surprise. It's true because they believe it, and they believe it because it's true. And that's really all Ken did here, right? My book says a thing. I like the thing that it says. All other considerations go right out the window. It's why he said in his debate with Bill Nye back in 2014 that there is nothing at all that would ever change his mind about his religious beliefs. He is a fanatic. He doesn't care if it's true. He can't live without the belief because he's an immature child and therefore nothing could ever change his mind. This is just sad, yet it's true of most hardcore theists, isn't it? William Lane Craig would never change his mind either, no matter how much evidence there was against his beliefs, because he's got the witness of the Holy Spirit. You know, that thing he just made up in his head. That's why he's low bar Bill, because he's just lowering the bar because he just wants it to be true. This is the problem with these people. They are not playing with a full deck. They've got a hand of jokers and no idea how the game is actually played. And they don't care. That's the worst part. They don't care. They're just repeating the same old tired drivel verbatim because they just wish that it made sense. It just doesn't. They just really want to believe. And that is never, ever, ever, ever going to be enough. These people need to grow the hell up. What the hell is wrong with them?